Did you guys see the new drama that's out there? Some people are pissed. There's a lot of people that think the fix is in, that everything's catered towards the Chiefs. They're the new Patriots. They get all the calls. They get all this, et cetera, et cetera. There's a video out there of Roger Goodell and Chris Jones of the Chiefs embracing after the game. And Roger Goodell is caught saying, "I don't care how you hit the quarterback," and they're laughing it up. And everyone says, "See, this is the bias. This is the bias with the Kansas City Chiefs in the league." So if you're wondering why people are still complaining about the Chiefs winning that Super Bowl and still crying about the holding penalty that you could have called at least a couple of times in that one play, Kansas City's now got that narrative sort of wrapped around them because your guy Roger Goodell, out there talking about officiating being at an all-time best.
They did get penalty flags at the worst time during a possible moment of a game at the end of the games, like back-to-back.
They were both penalties.
They were. It was just bad timing.
I don't get the whole why then. Why call it then? Okay, so what's the cutoff point?
I don't get the
7
argument.
minutes to go in the game. You can't make that call anymore?
I don't get the argument. I understand 100% that they were both fouls. I'm just saying. The timing of them was just crazy.
So
crazy.
I've gotten into a Twitter debate with Joel Klatt because Joel had a big issue
Fake JKS.
with the penalty. What'd you say there, Jonas?
Fake JKS.
Fake
JKS.
Yes.
I didn't talk over you. And his response eventually, because the one thing I wanted to point out to him was, and he knows this, because Mike Pereira and Dean Blandino, who are former VPs of officiating, are the best in the business, and they do as good of a job as anyone of educating us as analysts and those that work for Fox, along with other officials, on educating them on how this all works, the rules, etc. The thing that he knows is that officials aren't trained and don't take into account the consequences of making a call based on the time of the game. So they're not taking into account the fact that it's the end of the game and that call is most likely going to determine the end, right? So instead of getting a field goal and then Jalen Hurts and the Philadelphia Eagles a last-minute drive and a chance to either tie with the field goal or win it with a touchdown, instead of getting the ending we all hoped for, we got the ending that we got. Well, the officials aren't taking that into account. They don't care about us as viewers wanting to have that sort of ending to a game. They're looking at the play and they're determining, did, for example, in that instance, James Bradbury grab Juju Smith-Schuster and cause defensive holding? He probably could have gotten called twice in that particular play, as you pointed out,
Before the third
I think the biggest thing that you look at is breaking down the route itself and what you're trying to accomplish in it, right? So some people will call it a whip return. So you're running down inside to try to sell a slant, to try to sell a shallow cross. You're putting your foot in the ground to change direction and go back outside, which is the part of that whip route or whip return. And then what they actually turned it into was a wheel because they're trying to take a shot at the end zone knowing it's man-to-man and that James Bradbury is one-on-one. Well, the biggest issue with where defensive holding comes into play is James Bradbury obviously defends the inside. He doesn't want to have this inside leverage beaten. And so as he goes to jump down inside, and once he realizes Juju Smith-Schuster is about ready to return outside, he then grabs his hips and jersey and pulls himself back into position.
Can't do it.
You can't do that. I mean, that's the definition of defensive holding, and for that very reason, because in that instance, the defender is then gaining an advantage. Then he pulls him a second time once he realizes that, oh no, Juju's going vertical off this, to then help himself stay, what's it called, in phase and try to stay at the hip of the receiver. And for people out there who don't understand this, the ball being catchable doesn't matter. That's only in pass interference. This was defensive holding. Completely different. So it doesn't matter if the ball is catchable or not. And in fact, it doesn't matter if he's the intended target. You can still call defensive holding even though they're not throwing at that receiver.
By the way, I can't believe people needed that to be clarified. Like, it wasn't pass interference. This has been in the rules for how long?
But here's the other thing that needs to be clarified. I had someone say something, well, he's given 5 yards. It's like, no. That's illegal contact, where you have a 5-yard cushion essentially to be able to be physical and use your hands. After that 5 yards, you're not able to.
Right.
That's a different rule.
And they still let you touch, but it is, hand jousting and stuff like that, but it is a different rule. You're right.
So even that people confuse and they're like, well, I thought in defensive holding he's got a 5-yard cushion. It's like, no, you're missing the point of what defensive holding is versus illegal contact versus pass interference. And so, look, maybe that's the NFL and their officiating and their lack of ability to communicate the rules better, but that's just where the conversation starts. So then you have someone like Joel Klatt who says, well, look, the problem is it's inconsistent, and you have to have objective fouls or penalties and subjective fouls and penalties, and they're officiated differently. Objective ones, you got to get them right. Subjective calls, you have to be consistent. So him basically saying defensive holding is a subjective call, and if they didn't call it earlier in the game, they shouldn't call it at that point in the game. So my response to that is the issue you have then is you're basically saying we're okay with being consistently bad on subjective calls. So you're either making bad subjective calls or you're not making the calls that should have been made that are considered subjective calls that are bad. But as long as we're consistent, you feel good about it.
Yeah.
Like, that's not a solution either. We should be trying to get every objective call and subjective call right. And how you go about doing that is being able to implement replay like we have it and being able to have a challenge by a coach where they can go challenge that and they can go back up to replay. And instead of following what we currently have is whatever the call is on the field is what we have to go by, and there has to be a burden of proof in order to overturn it, have that replay official then decide, okay, based on the rule, is it defensive holding or is it not? And if it is, so be it. But when you provide the coaches an opportunity to throw a challenge flag, to go and review that at any point in time during the game, you at least allow them the chance to challenge it, whether it's earlier in the game where it should have been called and wasn't, or later in the game. And so you allow there to be more consistency. You allow there to be, at least in this case, not even so much more consistency, but at least the chance to get it right. And that's my issue with this whole process is we have the technical capabilities to get it right, but for whatever reason, the NFL doesn't want to implement that.
No, they don't have enough money. There's not enough money in the league, so they got to make sure that they can pay the bills there, the NFL. They didn't make enough money from 113 to 180 million people watching the Super Bowl.
Why are you mad?
Well, I'm just saying, like, this is, I don't know why we're still having the conversation after all these years, and they like half-ass remedies. They put a Band-Aid on a bullet hole and say, well, we can challenge PIs for a year, and then they got rid of that after a year. It's like, come on, dude, there's ways.
The funny thing was Klatt used the example of baseball and an umpire not being consistent with the strike zone. And the irony to that is, what is baseball now starting to implement?
Robot
They literally
umps.
have a camera to put in a
Right.
strike zone so it's more consistent, so they get it right.
By the way, I wouldn't
Like,
use...
literally, like, the example you used was the worst example you could use for that.
I would. Of all the sports, the last
Of all
one
the
I would
sports
use...
used, he uses baseball.
Yeah, that would be the last
Great.
one I would use.
Good argument.